Welcome to University Television Presents. I'm Jake Zahm, and it's a privilege to sit down with Ken Elzinga, one of the most celebrated educators in economics. Since 1967, he has taught at the University of Virginia, where his introductory economics course remains one of the largest on campus. An expert in antitrust law and an acclaimed author, Professor Elzinga brings a unique perspective to the intersection of economics, policy, and storytelling. Ken, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be here, Jake.
I'm very excited to spend this time with you and learn a little bit more about you. Would you mind if we just jump right in?
I'm ready to go.
Perfect. All right, so your lecture is titled Adam Smith's Obvious and Simple System of Natural Liberty. Would you mind explaining to me what makes Adam Smith's system both obvious and simple?
Sure. That's a quote from Smith. He referred to the market system, free enterprise, capitalism, as an obvious and simple system of natural liberty. And I teach economics. That's my day job at the University of Virginia.
Right.
And I've been intrigued by that quote because for many of my students, economics is not something that's obvious and simple. So to me, it's kind of a play on words that for a genius like Adam Smith, in writing this book that is the foundation of modern economics, it really is. Economics, in some sense, starts with Adam Smith, a book called The Wealth of Nations. The book was published in 1776, a very important year in the life of our country,
Right.
very important year in the history of economics. But he used the expression, obvious and simple system of natural liberty, and yet I have students who struggle with the graphs and the theory of economics, and I say, well, it's supposed to be obvious and simple, but the reason I have a job, the reason I get paid to teach economics is because it's not that obvious and it's not that simple.
Right. Yeah, I would be one of those students that I would look at that and go, wow, that's not obvious and simple for my brain to comprehend. So I guess my next question would be is how do Adam Smith's principles influence your approach to teaching economics?
Well, I would say in two ways, Jake. One is the obvious one, that the discipline that Adam Smith really started, the discipline of economics, is what I teach. And the interesting thing is that many of the principles that I teach, such as specialization and division of labor, all was there in Smith. There's just so much in modern economics that you can find in Smith. But what affects me as a teacher, I take teaching very seriously. I'm at a research university. My salary is really a function of how much research I get published. But my heart is really with teaching. I love teaching. I love my students. I consider it a privilege to be a teacher.
Yeah.
And Smith tried to be such a careful expositor of his ideas. Maybe the obvious and simple system of natural liberty was a bit of an exaggeration. But he taught a lot in his book by way of examples. And economists are often thought of as pretty dull teachers. Maybe we deserve that reputation because we talk about widgets and we use graphs and equations. So when I teach principles, I teach a very large course at the University of Virginia. I've taught it for years. There's about 1,000 students in it. I try to be really careful to think, all right, now Smith came up with examples. He didn't talk about widgets. He talked about pin factories, things that people could relate to. So a lot of my teaching, while we use graphs, and some of my students think it's a rather mathematical course, I also go over and over again to examples. And I try to draw examples from art history, from music, not always just current things with students, but historical examples. Teaching by way of example is a really big deal to me.
Right.
And Smith did that as well in his book.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. As you were saying earlier, there is sort of a stereotype that economics is sort of dull or, not something as exciting as some students may want it to be. But you're very impressive in the way that you get 1,000 students to sign up for a course in a semester. I mean, that to me, I read that and was just impressed. I'm curious, my next question would be, for you doing this for, 50 plus years now, what has been a key to your success and what has been a key to your longevity in teaching for a good amount of time?
So I'll take the second part of your question first.
Yeah.
I just consider myself to have a dream job
Yeah.
that I get to go in and work with young people, and I get to do research in topics that I find interesting. But what I think attracts the thousands of people year after year is something I alluded to earlier. I try not to make the class hopelessly abstract. I tell students when they come in that this is not just a class for students who want to be an econ major. If that happens, that's fine with me. Yeah. But I think of it as the terminal class in econ, and I tell the students explicitly, if you're a music major, if you're art history, if you're in the humanities, if that's what where your passion is, I want you to be welcome in this class, and I want you to know that what I'm going to do is give you a perspective on the world that other disciplines won't give you, and that I think it's a helpful discipline, a helpful perspective to know, but it's not the only perspective. I make no claims that economics is really the only way to look at the world. In fact, I tease them a bit. I say, look, music and cooking, these are much more important than economics, but economics is worth it to spend a semester trying to understand. Yeah. I think the other two things that have been really helpful for me in my teaching at the University of Virginia is I work really hard on the lectures. I've been doing this for a long time. So if you take something like elasticity, a very important concept in demand theory. I have taught elasticity for over 50 years. I've given a lecture on elasticity, but every year I give it, I go back to last year's lecture. I think, what can I do to improve this? And in the course of the year, if I see some great example, say in the Wall Street Journal on elasticity, I'll clip it. Yeah. It may be in March, and then I'll look back on that in September and say, is this a good example? Sometimes it is. Sometimes I think, why did I clip that? It's not that, isn't that great? And so I work really hard on the lectures. But the other thing is, notwithstanding the size of the class, I want every student in that class to know and to believe that if they wanted to see me personally, they could do that. Yeah. It was a funny angle. There isn't enough hours in the day for that to happen with everybody, but I think all of my students know that if I wanted to go see Elzinga in his office, he would be there, and he would talk with me, and he wouldn't shoot me out, and wouldn't say, oh, it's 5 o'clock, I gotta go. So office hours are a very big deal to me. Yeah. I spend a lot of hours in office hours. They start at 2:30, they often go until 7 o'clock. Because I don't want a student, usually have to wait about a half hour to see me because of the queue. And I don't want a student at 5 o'clock to have me come out and say, oh, office hours are over, goodbye. Right. So everybody knows, hey, I will stay as long as they're there. Mm-hmm. And even though that's only 10 or 15 students, the word gets out. Yeah, he gives this big lecture, but you can go talk to him in his office. Mm-hmm. And for me, that, I went to a little college in Michigan, 1,200 students. Mm-hmm. So my econ class is almost the size of my whole college. Right. And my college was very personal, and I want my students to know that there's a personal angle. Now, for them, they have discussion sections they can go to with 20 students in that, and I've got over 20 TAs, so there's a personal angle there as well. Right. But I want them to know that, yeah, I care about them. They'll come to my office, I'll be happy to chat with them. Yeah. Well, I applaud that. As a student, I applaud the transparency and you making time for your students. And it seemed that you do have a real passion for what you do, and not everyone does. And so I think that's great that you have this passion for teaching. I'm curious as to, was there a point in your life where you knew this was what you wanted to do, or did you happen to just stumble into this career? I stumbled into it. That's a good way to put it. Yeah. I'm first generation college. I grew up in a home where nobody had gone to college. Nobody talked about college. And unlike some of the first generation students that I have at the University of Virginia, who have parents, often immigrant parents, for whom their child going to college is a big deal, and they push and push to make sure that happens. I was under no pressure to go to college. Right. My mom and dad, I was raised in an environment where you were to work hard and be honest. So if I'd gone off and worked for the power company, become a policeman, worked construction, my family would have been fine with that. Right. I worked in a sporting goods store, started very young when I was 14, and worked in junior high and high school. And my boss was a college graduate, and he encouraged me to go to college. Wow. And there was a college in my hometown, Kalamazoo College. and I could continue to work at that store. And when I went to college, my goal, this is the stumbling part,
Yeah.
I wanted to be a fishing tackle salesman because
Oh,
I
wow.
worked in a sporting goods store, and we sold a lot of fishing tackle, we sold a lot of hunting equipment, and I knew a lot about that stuff. And even in high school, I was on the floor selling, and I thought, I'd like to be a fishing tackle salesman. But my boss thought I should go to college, I could work Wednesday night, Friday night, and all day Saturdays when I could work. So I was in that store a lot.
Right.
And there was no business school. There was just an econ department in this little college. So I thought, well, I guess that's where, if you're going to sell fishing tackle, you become an econ major. I had no idea what econ was like, and it turns out I had very little to do with selling fishing tackle. But that was my major. And I was a very mediocre student at first, but because I hadn't been in a college curriculum in high school. I was in the shop curriculum. But this professor took an interest in me. Why? I don't know. I just consider it God's grace. I really do. There's no explanation other than that he took an interest in me. He saw potential that nobody else saw in my high school. I didn't see it. And so I was a pretty poor student at first, and then I started to figure out, oh, the way you succeed in this is you study. You don't go to the pool hall where your high school buddies were. And so I started to become a good student, and he encouraged me to apply for a fellowship. It was a very prestigious fellowship, and it paid your whole way through graduate school.
Wow.
And he encouraged me to apply for it. I had no thoughts that I would get it. But the only thing you had to do, in addition to, if you to be a candidate, is you had to be open to being a college professor. And he said, Ken, are you open to that? I said, well, yeah. I mean, I admired him a lot. And so I said, okay, and I won the fellowship and went to graduate school, and that sort of ended being a fishing tackle salesman.
Right.
It turned out being a professor at UVA, I thought was a better job.
Yeah.
Even though I still like the idea of retailing, and I still, I grew up, to me, being in sales, a very honorable profession. I don't look, a lot of academics look down upon that. I do not at all.
Yeah, sales is not an easy thing, and it seems like you had experience doing that in that tackle shop.
But the other thing, I haven't really thought about this, Jake, and I wouldn't put a lot of chips on it, but I do think being in retailing, maybe especially in a sporting goods store where somebody comes in and somebody might just want to buy a hunting gun, or they just want a 22 to go out and plink. But somebody else comes in and they're looking at a Browning over and under shotgun, and they're well-to-do, they're educated people, they're going to spend a lot of money. And to be able to relate to these people and try to figure out what are they looking for, how can you help them? That was very much, how can you help them get where they want to go? And in some ways, that's what my teacher did for me, is how could he help me get somewhere where I might want to go? And I didn't know all the options, just as when somebody comes in to buy a shotgun, they may not know all the different options and nuances, and you're there to explain. Well, what's the advantage of a pump action versus an over and under? And if you know that stuff, you can help somebody. And that's how I looked upon a couple of my professors at Kalamazoo College. They were there for me when I didn't deserve it, when I didn't know what was going on. And I'm sure there are professors here at Boise State who are eager to do that as well for their students.
Yeah. I mean, that's an amazing story, hearing that, your professor saw something in you that you necessarily didn't see in yourself, and they wanted to help you as best as they could, and saw that in you, and here you are,
Jake, there are still people back in Kalamazoo who knew me in high school who know that I'm a professor and find that, really? He's
This
a professor?
guy?
Yeah, this guy's a professor. And I have people in my family, cousins of mine and so on, somewhat puzzled by that. But they just didn't understand what can be a transforming experience for a first-gen student to go to a college or a university, if there's somebody who cares. I think, frankly, I was in Michigan. If I had gone to a Michigan State University or University of Michigan, those wouldn't have been options because I would have had to live in a dorm. That wasn't a financial option. But if I'd gone to a big university, and I'm talking about something much bigger than Boise State, I might have just gotten lost. Maybe, I don't know, but I think the probability is lower that I would meet a professor there who would take that kind of interest in me.
It sounds like you had almost a path laid out in front of you, and it almost just, I think that's remarkable, truly, and here you are, and enjoying and making a change and a positive influence on people and your students, and I think that's great. I then would like to jump ahead, since we're talking about stories and paths. I'm very interested in your writing, very interested. Could you tell us some of your works that you've written through the pen name of Marshall Jevons, and would you mind explaining a little bit about how you tie economics into your work?
Sure. Let me put it in context, first of all, just in terms of my time at UVA. So, the University of Virginia is a university that takes research very, very seriously. So, and I take that seriously as part of my mission. So, most of my writing has my name on it, and it'll appear in academic journals or books with university presses. So, I have a book with Yale University Press, and I publish in scholarly journals. And that's the main thing over here. Through a very quirky circumstance, through a good friend of mine on the faculty at the University of Virginia, I started to write with him fiction. But we were uncertain about whether this was any good, frankly, whether we wanted to be identified with it, so we adopted a pen name. So our pen name was Marshall Jevons, which is the first name of Alfred Marshall, one of my favorite economists, and the last name of William Stanley Jevons, my colleague's, one of his favorite economists. So that was our pen name.
Wow.
The gimmick that we had is, so to speak, the literary gimmick is we write detective fiction, and the hero is an economist, a professor of economics, and he solves the crimes using economic theory. So that's the kind of unusual thing we brought into the genre of detective fiction. We write under the name of Marshall Jevons. Our central character is Henry Spearman. There are now 4 books with Henry Spearman, the same protagonist in all of them. Henry Spearman is patterned after a very famous economist that my colleague and co-author and I both admire. He's like a hero to us of a contemporary economist. So just as Adam Smith would be a hero from way back, Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize-winning economist for many years at the University of Chicago, was someone that my colleague Bill and I admired very much. So when you write fiction, which I'd never done before, they said, you have to write about something you know. So something we knew was being an econ professor, and the econ professor that we admired very much was Milton Friedman. So we created a character named Henry Spearman. Note the same number of syllables, there's a certain parallel. And because we knew Friedman, my colleague knew him much better than I did, we would, in setting a scene, we would try to think, what would Milton Friedman be like in this scene? What would he be like? How would he think? How would he talk? And so the first one takes place on the island of St. John. The Spearmans, Henry and his wife, are on vacation, and a crime occurs, and he uses economic theory to solve the crime. And that book, very difficult to get it published. That's a whole different story, but finally it got published, and it got a very strong review in the Wall Street Journal. And it just sort of took off after that. I thought I was all done writing fiction. It's very hard to write fiction. It's a creative process. It is easier to write for a scholarly journal than it is to write fiction. That was a surprise to me, and a painful surprise. And I thought I was done with it, and then MIT Press came to Bill and me, and this is a very distinguished academic press, and they had never done a work of fiction. And they asked us, would we do a work of fiction with Henry Spearman? They wanted to publish a novel, to publish fiction, but it's MIT, and they wanted it to be cerebral. They wanted a professor to be in this. So we did a second one that was called The Fatal Equilibrium, and then I thought I was done with it. And then I was a visiting professor at Cambridge University in England, and it just was such a cool place. And I invited Bill, came over, and he stayed with us for a while, my wife and me, and we did a third one called The Deadly Indifference. And I thought that was the end of it. And then we were encouraged by a story I won't go into to do a fourth called The Mystery of the Invisible Hand, and that's the most recent one. Spearman is the continual hero through all of them, but it takes place in different settings where the crime takes place and where Henry solves the crime. The hard thing for us is we cannot use the traditional things of forensic evidence or interviewing somebody and beating them up or whatever to get the truth out of them. We have to use economic theory, and that's very hard.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
very contrived. I'm the first to admit that it's an implausible way. Nobody has read our books and say, this is how we're going to run a police department
Yeah,
from now
yeah.
on. We'll hire economists
Right.
to solve the crime.
Let's make this happen.
Yeah, it's been a fun thing, though. It's acquainted me with a wholly different community than I would have as an economist. It's got me into the community of mystery writers. I once was a judge with Mystery Writers of America to pick the best novel of the year. So it's kind of like in mystery fiction, the Oscars for best movie, only it's called the Edgar, named after Edgar Allan Poe.
Oh.
And just as there's a statue of an Oscar, whoever Oscar was for a movie, the winner gets a bust of Edgar Allan Poe.
Wow.
And I was on a committee one time to pick the best mystery of one year. And so I've been able to get into a milieu of the humanities, people who write for a living, and that's been a fun thing as well.
Yeah.
They're a very different tribe than the academic economists.
Right. Yeah, you can see a little bit of a dichotomy there.
Yeah, very much so.
So your fourth book, I mean, having the title with Invisible Hand in it, now I'm curious, have you taken any lessons that you found from Adam Smith and written them into your book, or?
In some ways, yes.
Yeah.
Just in the sense that Smith was such a brilliant economist. He taught us a lot about how you think like an economist. And that's what Henry Spearman is. He's a consummate, all of his analysis, I mean, it's contrived, but mystery fiction is contrived in a way. Everything he looks at through the lens of economics. And to some extent, Adam Smith was like that as well. That was what made him a great economist, is he began to pull things together that nobody had really thought of as economics, and he pulled them together. Now, the title of the last book, The Mystery of the Invisible Hand, I'll talk about that in my lecture tonight. The invisible hand is a metaphor from Adam Smith.
Right.
And I would argue that it is the most famous metaphor in all of the social sciences.
Yeah.
That this concept that there could be an invisible hand moving resources around through market interaction is a brilliant metaphor for how markets work, how people buy and sell, exchange information, pursue their own interests, and in that way, the common good is somehow pursued as well, or we reach a common good through people pursuing their self-interest. How could that be? Smith said, well, it's by an invisible hand.
Right.
So the mystery of the invisible hand, that is straight from Smith.
Right, yeah. So now I'm curious, since we're talking about your lecture and Adam Smith, I had researched and then talked to you prior to this interview about your interest in C.S. Lewis and how they have impacted your life and works. Would you mind telling us a little bit about how C.S. Lewis has impacted you overall?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. It'll take us in a different direction than you might have anticipated.
That's okay. Yeah.
So for me, as I alluded to, the first time I ever went away from home, ever lived in a dorm, was graduate school.
Oh, wow.
So my experience very different than that of my students at
Yeah.
UVA, who were all accustomed to college. And my mom had died when I was fairly young, and so now for the first time in my life, I wasn't living with my dad. I was in a dorm. For the first time in my life, I had spending money. This research scholarship that I wanted to go to graduate school, like I had money I never had before. It was so generous. And but I wondered, where am I spiritually? I'm away from home. My mom's gone. She was a very godly woman. And I decided to go to church.
Yeah.
And through people in this church, I became acquainted with C.S. Lewis, who many people become acquainted with him through the Narnia tales. And many children learn the Narnia tales,
myself.
whether their parents are Christians or not. This is a wonderful, wonderful story.
Yeah.
Well, I became acquainted with Lewis through a book called Mere Christianity. And I found it a very challenging book to read, because it essentially made a case for the Christian faith in a way that was very logical to me, the way I thought as an economist. It was like an argument for why Jesus was the Son of God.
Right.
And I found that compelling.
Yeah.
And my Christian commitment really deepened while I was a graduate student in a way that just really centered my life in a way that it wasn't before. So I give a lot of credit to Lewis, and so I began to really want to know more about this man. So when I've been in England, I've gone to his home, I've gone to the pub that he used to hang out with, where J.R. Tolkien and Dorothy Sayers I did Addison's Walk, which Lewis used to take regularly with J.R.R. Tolkien. He and Tolkien were close friends.
Right.
And I just began collecting stuff on Lewis. And then I began trying to think, how does Lewis differ from Adam Smith? Lewis never took an econ class, so far as we know, but Lewis had views on the proper economic order. And it turns out they're very similar to Smith. Smith was a great believer in free markets because he thought they were efficient. Lewis disliked socialism very much, central planning of an economy, because he believed so much in what in sort of theological circles is called the fall of man, the fall of Adam and Eve, that we're fallen creatures, we've sinned before God. And Lewis said, well, if that's really true, we can't trust people to be our masters because they're fallen people.
Right.
So he's very suspicious of central planning and socialism because it gave people control over other people.
Others.
So Lewis is sort of a free market guy for theological reasons.
Right.
Adam Smith is a free market guy for efficiency reasons.
Yeah.
But they both sort of came out, a humanist and a social scientist both came around to being these vigorous defenders in their own language of basically Adam Smith's obvious and simple system of natural liberty. You let people have private property and you let them exchange. And out of that will come the common good. Lewis says, you let them do that because if you have it by central control, you'll get corrupt people. What is the expression? Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Right.
Lewis very much embedded that in his own view of government.
Yeah. So it seems like they both sort of walked different paths, but ended up at the same destination in their beliefs.
Similar.
Yeah. So you kind of answered a question that I had, which was, what are the impacts that C.S. Lewis and Adam Smith had on you, and do they overlap? My next question would then be, are you going to be talking about that in your lecture tonight? Is there any C.S. Lewis mention tonight?
I am going to make a mention of C.S. Lewis, yes. In fact, I have one slide that has a picture of Lewis and a quote from Lewis.
Okay.
The lecture is not the influence of Adam Smith on C.S. Lewis or vice versa. The lecture, as I understand it, it's an endowed lecture to talk about Adam Smith, so that's going to be the focal point.
Right.
But for me, it's really hard for me to talk about Adam Smith a lot without Lewis, this really important person in my life, coming in. So there will be, as I recall, one slide with a picture of C.S. Lewis. So if my audience has never seen what this guy looks like or never heard of him, they'll see a quote from C.S. Lewis and a picture of him.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. So I guess just my last question that I would have is sort of I always like to ask a question for advice and future students. So reflecting on your career, what do you hope that students and colleagues take away from your contribution to economics, both in academia and your literary works?
Sure. So I taught long enough, Jake, to be under no illusions that when I run into a student. So today, for example, I had breakfast with a guy named Bill Palumbo, who was a student of mine, a brilliant student, 35 years ago.
Wow.
And he was in Boise. I hadn't seen him since the last time I was in Boise, which was some years ago.
Wow.
And we had a wonderful time together. Bill was a brilliant student. He went on to get a law degree from Stanford, and he has an MBA from NYU in finance. So a very smart guy. But what I hope my relationship with Bill was not just teaching him the formula for the elasticity of demand. Now, Bill probably remembers it, but most of my students, I'm under no illusions that they remember that. But I hope they know that they're created in God's image. They're put on this planet to do things that would be not just in their own narrow self-interest, but kind to others. And I'm hoping through my teaching, I not only teach a perspective, but demonstrate sort of a case for kindness and caring for people that maybe didn't have a break or need a break. I think of myself and the professor who influenced me. Obviously, I can't escape that. I think, well, he did that for me. What kind of professor am I going to be? Well, I don't want to be a professor who doesn't care for my students. And so I want my students, most of whom won't be professors, but whatever they're going to do, whether you go into video journalism or whether you continue in lawn care, that the people you serve will really know that you don't just see them as a source of income, but they're created in God's image. And so you're going to treat them with real integrity and honesty and compassion and with humility on your part. And that's what I'm hoping my students will ultimately come away with.
Yeah, I love that. That's actually, since you brought up lawn care and things like that, that's one of my lines for my business. Is my slogan is rooted in community. I think it's so important to,
That's great in lawn care.
Yeah, yeah.
Double
Oh, thank
entendre,
you.
yeah.
Yeah, it's very
Very
important
nice.
to make those make that community and relationships with people, and do a little bit more outside of just financial relationship. And well, with that, I really appreciate this, Ken. It's been amazing to talk to you, and I
Great to
appreciate
visit
your
with you.
time. Thank you all so much for joining us today on University Television Presents, and thank you for watching from home. Have a great day. And the music will come.